Hello and welcome to the final week of the Loft's virtual Wordplay. My name is Caitlin Boland and I am the Individual Giving Director at the Loft. We're so glad you're here. We hope that during the challenges of COVID-19 that this little corner has been a place of respite and creative inspiration for you. As you may know, when we began planning Wordplay, our intention was to have 100 authors and 10,000 visitors celebrating books in downtown East Minneapolis. Well, with a quick and thoughtful pivot, we have loved the opportunity to engage with you at home, bringing you conversations with today's top authors on conversation topics across the spectrum. Because you have shown up for us, we've reached over 40,000 viewers across the country. We are so grateful to provide all of our Wordplay sessions to you free of charge, and that is due in large part thanks to the forward-thinking generosity and leadership of our sponsors, and especially our founding partners, St. Catherine University and Star Tribune. We would not be here without them. And while their support has gotten us this far, we turn to you, our dear virtual audience members, to bring us to the finish line. This week, as Minnesota raises funds as part of hashtag GiveAtHomeMN, and as we celebrate hashtag Giving Tuesday now across the U.S., we ask you to please consider including the Loft in your giving plans. Your gift of any size allows readers and writers to continue to receive support through classes, fellowships, events, challenging conversations, and more, all at the Loft. And your donation will automatically make you one of our fantastic members. We hope you will support us as we support the literary community. Thank you for all you do for the Loft, and enjoy Wordplay.
Hi, I'm Gabriella Page-Fort, Editorial Director at Amazon Crossing, and I'm here today with Icelandic author Kristín Eiríksdóttir and translator Larissa Kyzer to talk about their collaboration on the novel A Fist or a Heart, which Amazon Crossing published last fall. We're here on Wordplay, thanks to sponsors St. Catherine University and Star Tribune. And if you're intrigued by our discussion, there's actually a button right below the screen that you can click on at any time to buy the book from Moon Palace Books, which is a friend to the Loft in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm told they also have great pizza. So we're going to have a nice discussion, and at the end, there's going to be an opportunity for Q&A. If you have any questions while you're watching the conversation, please add them in the comments on whatever forum you're using to watch. So here with me today, at the bottom of the screen, is author Kristín Eiríksdóttir, an award-winning novelist, short story writer, poet, and playwright from Reykjavik, Iceland. Her original edition of A Fist or a Heart won the Icelandic Literature Prize in 2017, as well as the Icelandic Women's Literature Prize 2018, and was nominated for the Nordic Council Literature Prize for 2019. The novel took second place for the Icelandic Booksellers Prize and was selected as one of the best novels of 2017 by the Icelandic National Radio. Eiríksdóttir has published 7 books and had 3 plays staged. Her short fiction has appeared in Best European Fiction 2011. A Fist or a Heart is her first novel to be translated into English. And it's very exciting that Larissa Kyzer is the translator to do so. She's a writer and a translator, and I think if you read the novel, that comes through really clearly, that she has a voice of her own as a writer. She holds an MS in Library and Information Science and a BA in Comp Lit. In 2012, she received a Fulbright grant to Iceland, where she lived for 5 years and earned an MA in Translation Studies. Her published translations have been varied and include novels, children's books, and chapter books for young readers, short stories, poetry, essays, and nonfiction. Kyzer is a board member of OS, an Iceland-based international and literary collective, and is a member of the American Literary Translators Association and PEN America. She lives in Brooklyn, New York. So I've been waiting for this. We've been working on this book now about 2 years as a group. Since I found out about this book at the London Book Fair with the Tic Tacs branded with the Icelandic book cover, I've been completely obsessed. And this is actually the first time that the three of us are getting to sit down and talk about why that is. What is it about this book that makes somebody feel so connected to it even before they've even read it? And after reading it, it's now been quite a while since my first reading of the complete novel in English, and I still feel like it lives with me. I feel like the voice of this narrator, Ellen, remains with me in my life. So I think that one of the first things I wanted to ask was about style. Kristín, you've written in your career across genres and across forms. And I think in this book, you really demonstrate how those forms influence each other and how maybe the artist's voice transcends the medium on some level. I really love that our narrator is a prop maker who's sitting down to write a novel. Is this something that you studied and pursued, this mixture of poetry and theater and prose? Or is this something that came to you in sort of a natural way?
Hi. It's a good question. I think that it's my background that is speaking. I didn't know if I would write novels. I started publishing very young, and those were poetry collections or short prose, which also contained drawings, and I was very occupied with sort of using drawings as a part of the book rather than illustrations. I studied visual arts, so so I didn't know really until I started writing short stories for the first time, and that sort of took over. And also my background is in performance art. That's what my main focus was after I graduated from school. So I was doing writing and performing for a couple of years, and so it's been hard for me to sort of choose a format, and I get easily bored, and I'm a little bit all over the place. So I travel. But right now I'm writing a novel, and I'm also making an adaptation for theater at the same time. Sort of sometimes I will do both in the same day, and of course that will influence the novel. I'm making an adaptation out of Virginia Woolf's Orlando for the City Theatre here in Reykjavik, and yes, and that's hard to escape when I'm also writing a novel. So it's curious to see how that will sort of sneak in. Yeah, I think that was the answer.
I'm going to bask in that connection between minds there, between you and Virginia Woolf. Is the play in Icelandic? Is that an active translation as well?
It's in Icelandic, and we do have an excellent translation that is fairly recent. It's 3-year-old translation by Sofía Auður Birgisdóttir, and it's excellent. So I'm using the Icelandic translation. I'm so grateful for it being so good. But then of course I'm using the original text mainly. But so I will sort of construct my own sentences. It's not going to be directly from her translations, because also it's theater, so everything changes a little bit.
Yeah, my mind is getting sore trying to figure out what that novel will be like as a production. It's kind of a hard one to envision.
Yeah, well, they've made some pretty good adaptations.
Yeah.
I think mostly that's complicated not to think too much about, for example, the movie or different theater work that has been made out from the. I mean, it's like an endless, fountain of, yeah.
And I think that connection between, as a writer, to be embodying other writers' voices and to be engaged with translation across formats and across styles and languages is sort of a good segue to thinking about Larissa's role and bringing this really special and stylistically inventive novel into English. Can you talk to us a little bit, Larissa, about your experience trying to think about the novel and the elements of style that make up the novel and how that came through in your translation?
I think I learned a lot about the way I write from translating this. This was the first novel, like big novel I had translated. I had done a crime novel before, but that's such a different kind of writing. And I think I was more thinking about genre in that case than I was about the actual like elements of the language. Kristín writes so beautifully, but it's different, but it's compatible with the way that I write. It's often a lot more spare. I think she often trusts herself to word things very directly in a way that I kind of want to qualify and add all of these little like, well, maybe, but kind of rather, and like all of these transitional phrases. And so it was actually kind of empowering to like learn how to cut all that out. And like embodying this voice made me feel kind of maybe a little stronger in the way that I wanted to express myself. So it was definitely like sitting down in a language, but also it did feel very tactile, like a physical process of putting it on.
I think that comes across on the page, at least for this reader. There's sort of like the fact that she's a prop maker sort of has you thinking of the sentences as being constructed by hand. There's like a lot of emphasis on her hands having done work, and her like criticisms of the desk life and how hard it is to type and how hard it is on your back, sort of juxtaposed with that craftsmanship of the prop making. I feel like that plasticity in English isn't very easy to get. I don't speak Icelandic, but hearing people speak it, it sounds like it's full of bubbles that can bounce. So thinking about plastic and that language feels really natural, whereas English has all of these extremely sharp corners and square sounding structures. So I feel like you really did a lot, especially where the prose broke out into poetry. You used our language more softly, I feel like, than I'm used to.
That was, I mean, the poetry, I have to give a lot of credit to Kristín for. That was a challenge for me to, I am not a poet. I've started translating poetry more, which has also been like an interesting, like physical, I don't know why I think of it as such a physical process, but like I tend to think of writing as almost like if you're looking at an engine, and so you're sort of like taking it apart and seeing how like the mechanics of it kind of work. And so I can figure out the mechanics of prose usually kind of quickly. Like I can kind of get into the rhythm and see like, oh, like this is where this little gear works and this is how it hooks up here, and can kind of get into that. But with poetry, I haven't always understood like how the motor runs. So I had to sort of take it apart and try to put it back together. And then I got a lot of really, really helpful feedback and sort of guidance on that language from Kristín. And it was another place I think where I wanted to smooth things out. And it was really nice to have that encouragement to roughen it up a little bit. It's interesting that that's like a softness that you feel, but I felt like I was making it like rougher.
I think soft and rough in this, trying to use language to talk about language is always, it's like dancing about architecture, even when you're just talking about language with language. Which leads me, Kristín, to thinking about your multilingual abilities. To be able to work this closely on the translation, your mastery of English is clearly extreme. Have you worked on other translations and with other translators as closely?
No, this was my first time of but I think my problem was that I'm also a translator. I translate from English, mostly theater. No, I haven't. Some of my work has been translated into languages that I don't speak, and in a way that's maybe easier, but at the same time it's very difficult not to know what is happening, you know. But also being able to sort of, because English is my third language, it's not my territory, it's Larissa's, and then I think sometimes I would feel like I knew more than I do, and then sort of be in her way, but sometimes it worked out well, because because I'm like everyone, I'm like all writers, I'm very controlling when it comes to my text. And then but Larissa, I was so lucky to have her as my translator on this, because we also share taste and sort of we have the same sort of feelings, I think, and that's the most important part. So I hope she forgives me for sometimes being in the way, and I can see now that it was wrong of me.
I've spoken Icelandic for such a short period of time, and my spoken Icelandic is not even the same. So I would sometimes have a feeling that I had like an instinct for what was happening in the Icelandic, and it was usually like with a register. It was like an emotional register, or like I would think that I made things very dramatic, was something that we kept coming back to, because like there are these very expressive phrases in Icelandic that if you just look at them on the page, they look bigger, they look more emotional, and then they're actually, it turns out that they're much more part of just like a normal way of speaking. And so like I was learning all of these things about like registers in Icelandic that I had no idea about, and so it was kind of nice to figure out that like I have such a strong gut feeling for English, and Kristín has such a strong gut feeling for Icelandic. So like between the two of us, we have like a sort of our powers combined, and it was good.
Can we talk about Iceland? I feel like in a time where everyone is sort of practicing isolation, talking to an author from an island nation with no predators and no army and unarmed police, 360,000 people and more than 1,000 miles from the closest neighbor, a country known for gender equality and swimming pools and erupting volcanoes that screw up air travel worldwide. There's a lot of, I think, distance between a lot of our English language readership and maybe some of the norms of Icelandic culture. Are you seeing anything, Kristín, that you think that the world could learn from Iceland?
Linguistically, or?
You can answer it in any way that you want to. I think linguistically is a great answer, because I think your point of like focusing on the work being diverse and having the ways that your own projects are talking to one another actually populate your mind. I think that actually is something that a person who is comfortable being removed by the busyness of a social structure is maybe more likely to do than somebody who's constantly surrounded by loud voices that are not your own. I don't know. I think I have an idealized vision of Iceland, which was just expressed very directly. But I wonder if there are themes that you're seeing sort of folks coming around upon now that they might not have come around upon before, but that in Iceland they're taken for granted. Like the idea that highly emotional phrases are actually really not so emotional at all, maybe as an example.
Yeah, and it's not so emotional, definitely, but also they're just more grotesque. And I hadn't, some of them I hadn't thought about, but when you sort of visualize the sentence, you can see that it's a very disgusting image that's being drawn. But then in my mind, when I'm speaking Icelandic, it doesn't have an impact at all. So I can see why Larissa would sort of stumble upon it. I don't know why that is. Yeah, I mean, there's a certain. It's hard to talk about your country, I think. I don't have the distance, and it becomes very sort of simplified when I try to. But there's a roughness in the language for sure, and it's also strange, I think, or hard to imagine maybe what it feels like to write in a language that is changing so rapidly. And you know, it's languages die every day, and this is a very small language. Yeah, so that's also a part of it, I think. It's very old, and it's at the same time it's sort of dissolving into English, becoming a new language.
There's no board of directors to prevent it like there is in France.
Yeah, we have for sure, we have that sort of, but it I think, and they were very good at keeping it under control until the internet. Yeah, there's no way of controlling it anymore. To sort of, it was even in Iceland, if people would move to Iceland from different countries and they wanted to, and they became Icelandic citizens, they would have to change their name into an Icelandic version of their name. So Gerard would become Geirharður, and so forth.
People called me Lovisa for years.
Lovisa, yeah. It's very rude.
That is not my name.
It's very rude. Yeah.
There was something else that sort of segues to that I wanted to talk about, which is a quote from the book that Ellen says, "There's injustice because injustice is everywhere." And I think the sort of politicized nature of language is real. But I think inside of this novel, but also perhaps across your oeuvre as an artist, there is a theme that injustice is everywhere. But there is also sort of a triumphant, when justice wins, at least morally. What do you think about art as a form of protest or demand for social justice?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's I don't know if I was nominated for the Nordic Literature Award, so I was there when they gave it to a Danish author called Jonas Eka, and that was a very it's a literature award that it's known for being it's Scandinavian authors, and it's usually very academic writing and very poetic and very sort of much about the language, which is excellent. But this time they gave it to a very young, I think he's 27, Jonas Eka, and he had written a very political novel and very radical and sort of young and fresh and sort of yes, you know what I mean. And when he took the award, he made a long speech. People are only allowed to talk for a very short amount of time, but he went on forever, and he was talking about the refugee situation in the Scandinavian countries, and all of the ministers were there, the prime ministers of all of the countries, and he actually spoke directly to the Danish prime minister and called her a baby killer. And afterwards, none of the prime ministers clapped. They were sitting there and they were waiting to see if the Danish prime minister would start clapping, and she didn't. So none of them did. The Icelandic did like this, and then she realized that nobody was clapping. And I thought it was interesting because it says a lot about sort of the freedom of speech, and that I think she should have clapped because he is a citizen of her country, and he has the freedom to say whatever he wants to say on the stage, even if it's what he said. So that was interesting, and then Greta Thunberg, of course, got the environmental prize, and she didn't accept it. So I think there's a lot of political art, great art that is sort of happening now with artists, a sort of a new approach. It's been sort of talked about like this difficult thing to, political art. It's like two things that don't belong together, but of course they do. And I think that, but I don't have a plan in my mind when I work. I have, it's hard for, I have tried, but I never write anything down, and I don't really know what's going to happen. So I can't say that I ever have an agenda, and that's not the way of working that I can relate to. And I don't think that Jónas Eika does either. But there's definitely a way of sort of being political around your art, and how you present it, and I don't know. It's a complicated topic, I suppose.
I'm not going to spoil the novel for folks who are going to click the button below the screen and buy it and read it for themselves, but there is righteousness and a revenge plot line that runs through this novel that really made me salivate when Sif from Forlagid told me about it at the book fair. I think it's hard to come up with fictional narratives that have high enough stakes to actually communicate the power of being seen and having the events of one's life be made whole by their recognition and by their honesty, and by people being able to look back upon their histories and things that have happened to them. And rather than carrying the burden of injustice that has been forced upon themselves, find some path toward justice. And I think that in this novel, the path is extremely subtle and it's extremely interior, which really appealed to me, because I don't actually think revenge needs to be some sort of bloodbath or stage of glory. There doesn't need to be a head on a stick for me to feel like the justice has been served. I think it can be subtle. And I'm curious, in this novel, I love thinking about the fact that you didn't know that was going to happen when you were writing this novel, and that maybe that happened to this character as an outcome of the exercise and of the engagement between you as the author and with the work. In translating that as well, I think that there's, a lot of the reviews of this book have called it a thriller and a page turner. And I think it's really partially because of that through line of justice, and that's seeking the truth and seeking awareness of the truth. Where does that fit in your sort of philosophy? And I also want to talk about how Larissa understood that and found a way to bring that through from page to page, because I think that also was part of the translation process, was keeping that tension alive. But did you have a sort of scheme around how this particular character could seek justice?
Oh, no, I didn't have a scheme. But it's important what you say about it being interior, and because I think that the sort of perpetrators in the book, they aren't so much human beings, but they're more like these sort of parts of the story, and by that Elín, and it's I think the novel is a lot about, because she is what is happening is that she is beginning to interpret the world by symbols in a way, and it's what she sees is what she is, and it's the internal is becoming sort of her outer world, and what she remembers is what stayed with her, and that's usually the things that she didn't want to see when they were happening. So they're sort of exactly. It's an interior narrative, and I really wanted her to have some way of resolving it, but it wasn't realistic. That wasn't her story. Her story wasn't a sort of triumphant one. But I think that even if we can't see it, I think human beings, they are constantly sort of working out their issues, even subconsciously. They are sort of we have so much ability to sort of and resilience. And even if somebody seems like they're being crushed by life, they are actually working a lot of stuff out. Yeah. I hope that answers something.
Oh, it does.
Yeah.
Larissa?
I was just going to say that it was an interesting process because I read the book, I want to say like 6 times from the beginning to like going through the translation process and revising it, and I had sort of a different read on it each time, and like details that I hadn't really absorbed sort of came together each time that I read it. So because her mental state is sort of in flux, it's more about like a tone and about a feeling, and there's something really powerful about the fact that you just get to exist within these feelings from moment to moment, and it doesn't actually have to make sense for it to be a really meaningful process that she's going through. And having her try and write that out, even though she doesn't really understand it, and sort of deciding that she wants to tell the story, even though she's not even sure what the story is at this point, I thought was a really, well, I really enjoyed it as a reader, but I also, I think being able to sort of let go of the need to know, well, okay, so like this date lines up here and this specifically symbolizes this, and like not being so obsessed with the actual what of it, but the sort of emotional experience of it, and the interior truth of what this character is going through, even if it's not linear, or even if it doesn't all line up, or like, you know, maybe she says there are a couple places in the novel that we decided to just sort of leave inconsistencies, and we talked a lot about that during the copy editing and the proof editing, and certain things like maybe like we fix this date here or that date there, but then a lot of things don't line up, and that's reflective of the character, but it also, it doesn't, that sort of the factual aspects of those details doesn't make the story more or less true, or the experience more or less true. And I think that was a really interesting thing to experience sort of in real time as we were going through the translation.
The way that book makes you feel like you're losing your mind is really like, we talked about Virginia Woolf at the beginning of this conversation, but I feel like there's a definite Virginia Woolf comparison there. I'm thinking specifically Jacob's Room, but the way that the text and the way that your relationship to the text as a reader changes throughout your reading experience, and you go from trusting your own mind to not trusting your mind. And then there's a parallel within the novel, of course, to Alzheimer's and how that affects the mind and memory. I feel like that piece is, we only have 5 minutes left, and that's maybe too big of a can of worms to open this late in the conversation. But I do think that the act of allowing yourself to read a novel without forcing it to make sense sort of aligns with our narrator's development. She is able to trust herself and accept herself without forcing it to make sense. And I feel like that's the interiority, that's that sort of interior victory. The outcome is the kind of personal justice that I think each of us deserves in our lives. Is there anything else either of you wants to add before we open up the floor to questions from the audience?
I would welcome questions.
Yeah, so would I.
Great. Rachel, you want to come back and help us hear from the crowd?
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Rachel from the Loft, and we do have a few audience questions here. Our first one, you have been talking pretty in depth about this novel throughout your conversation, but we have a question from Pam who's just wondering if you could give a quick elevator pitch to familiarize people who maybe aren't as familiar with the plot of this novel, tell them about the book and what its inspiration was.
Yeah, is that for me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Go for it.
I didn't really hear the question. I'm sorry, but
Oh, I can say it again. Pam is wondering if you can give an elevator pitch to familiarize our audience with the book and talk about your inspiration for it.
an elevator pitch. Yeah, it's what's an elevator pitch? Gabrielle, can you help me?
Absolutely. It's a great example of our harsh corner-filled language. It's if you only have 12 seconds in the elevator with a studio producer from Hollywood and you want to tell them why this book is amazing.
I would never do that.
I know. That's where the phrase comes from. Basically, it's a brief introduction.
It's a brief intro. It's a story about a woman in her 70s who works as a props maker. She is a lone wolf, and she's gets to know a young woman who is a playwright who is 19, 20, and it's sort of about these two parallel stories, about this young playwright's story and the story of the props maker Elin. That was a very bad pitch.
It's a good pitch. That's a great first elevator pitch.
I think you should talk about how you came to write this book, though, because there is a pretty great answer to that question.
How I came to write it? I came to write it because my mother had Alzheimer's, and that's why. Did you mean that? Yeah, and I lost my mother in 2016 in November from Alzheimer's, and I also lost my grandmother from Alzheimer's, and also my grandfather. So it's been in my life for a long time, this sort of communicating with people who are losing grips with reality. So I started writing this book a month after my mother passed, and that was in December of 2016, and it was published in the fall of 2017. So I wrote it very fast, and it's a grieving process for me. But then at the same time, I think that doesn't really do it justice, because it's more than that. And I think that also the way I'm writing now is I'm writing out the story, but I feel like I have been working on it for years now. I know what it is, and it's just coming out on the. So I don't feel like I wrote it in only 3 or 4 months. I had been writing it for years and years, sort of through communicating with people with Alzheimer's, and it's sort of these stories that build up and add up in a way. So yes, yeah.
Thank you. Another question from our audience. We have one question wondering, what about, for both of you, since you both work in translation, what about translation itself feels political from the languages that you're translating into to whose work is getting translated? Larissa, I know that you run a reading series for women who work in translation or whose work is translated, and maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are all sorts of ways in which translation is a political act, just sort of inherently, as you said, like what gets chosen, who gets translated, what voices are being heard. And I don't think that translating from Icelandic is political in the same way that, you know, translating from an indigenous language, for instance, would be political. But I do think that as a language is being, like Icelandic, is being so inflected by English, there is sort of there's an importance, I think, to providing translation as a means of allowing people to continue to write in their native language and in a minority language, and not just sort of defaulting to English. I hear all the time people ask me why I need to be translating from Icelandic when Icelanders speak English so well. And it's true, Icelanders do speak English extremely well. It is a whole different thing to be translating than it is to be translating into a non-native language than it is to be translating into your mother language. But I think it's important to be a conduit and to support that creativity and that ongoing productivity of Icelandic. In terms of the reading series, I run a reading series called Jill, and it's a Women Plus, I've been calling it, in translation series. So that's both women and non-binary translators and translators of women and non-binary authors. And so the idea is just to encourage people to read works in translation by voices that aren't necessarily getting heard as much. And that sort of grew out of Women in Translation Month, which is in August every year. And that was sort of an initiative that was started to shine a light on how few women authors were relatively getting translated into English. And so I'm just sort of looking to expand upon that and build upon that. So we have translators who are at the very beginning of their career, and I really like having them read alongside people who are, you know, multi-award-winning translators who have 17 publications, or translations from languages that you don't hear that often. I just did one that we had Galician, Tibetan, and what was the third language? It might have been Spanish. But the point is to sort of mix and match and just bring as many voices to the table as possible.
Cool. Kristín, did you have anything to add?
No, no. It was really nice to meet you, and thank you for the interest.
Yeah. Well, we do have one final question from our audience, and then I'll pass it back over to you, Gabriella. But we have one more question, which is, who are other Icelandic contemporary writers who you would like to see translated?
Kristín, do you have I have lots of answers, but who would you like to see translated, Kristín?
There's a writer called Eva Rún Snorradóttir that I would really like to see translated. And then if I start saying names, then I could go on forever, of course. So maybe Larissa, you should take this one.
Well, I just actually read Eva Rún's last book, and it was really great. It's it brings together theater and poetry, and it's super cool. So it's another one of these sort of like genre bending or like genre combining books, which was exciting to read. So I second that one. I'm a really big fan of Frida Ísberg. She's a really young short story writer that's just got a phenomenal collection, and I've been working on poetry by an experimental poet named Kauri Tulinius. And I just, they're so form-based, and I find that really exciting, and I've never read anything like it. So, but you know, if anybody ever wants to know, send me an email, and I'll send you a book-long list of people who should be translated, because there's plenty of people.
Well,
And I'd throw in a plug for someone who is translated. Deep Vellum put out Ofigur Sigurdsson's book Orefi, The Wasteland, which if you haven't read it already, and it's available to you to read, it's a pretty spectacular book in Lytton Smith's translation.
Awesome. I'm gonna write all of those down right now and expand my library of Icelandic work. Well, that's all the time we have for audience questions. So I'm going to pass it back off to you, Gabriella. But
Thanks, Rachel. And thanks so much to everyone who's been watching and listening today. And thank you especially to Larissa and to Kristín for this opportunity. I really hope that folks choose to read the novel. And if you are interested in buying it, there's a link that you can click just below the screen to order from Moon Palace Books and support a local bookseller at the same time. And I'd also like to take another opportunity to thank Wordplay's presenting sponsors, St. Catherine University and Star Tribune. Thanks everyone so much.
Thank you.